I want to talk about the problem of rising inequality and the lack of social mobility in the United States. And I want to talk about skills and skill deficits, which I want to show you are major contributors to these problems. And I want you to think about the American skill problem and the problem really of inequality around the world in very broad terms. And I think we have to think of a very different conception of what skills are, and we need to think about how to understand and measure the skills that matter. The first point I want to make in this regard is that skills are multiple, and when many people think about skills, they're thinking about test scores or IQ. And I think that's important not to stay within that limited mindset. Social and emotional skills are as important, and for many tasks more important than IQ in measures of cognition. So what we've learned is that these cognitive and personality traits are not set in stone. They're not genetically determined. They can be fostered. And this is the role of institutions like the church, like the family, schools. And we have to really understand how these organizations work together to produce skills. Now, the skill formation process is a dynamic, synergistic process. What we've learned is that skills beget skills, motivation begets motivation and learning. And what we've come to understand is something that economists call dynamic complementarity is a key concept. For example, we found that the returns in an economic sense, the dollar return to a unit of investment, are higher for those who have greater capabilities. And that explains why prevention is so productive, why starting out at the early life conditions are so productive and remediation is not so productive. So we understand why it's productive to invest in the cognitive skills of disadvantaged young children and the non-cognitive skills as well. But why, when we look at social policy over the lifetime, the payoffs are so low for people who are severely disadvantaged, simply because the older you are, the later you wait, the more costly and the less efficient it is to make those investments. So creating these early investments gives you a basis for enhancing the productivity of later investment. And so this is the dynamism I want to talk about today. Children from advantaged environments, by and large, receive substantial early investments. That's well documented. I'll show you just how typical, how large the gaps are. But children from disadvantaged environments typically do not receive these investments. And so here we come to what I think is a fundamental component of public policy that's neglected, and that is the role of the family. The role of the family in producing the capabilities that matter is fundamental. Now, in the United States and around the world, the family is under challenge. And what we have to understand about the family is that the true measure of disadvantage of a child is the quality of its parenting. It's not just money, it's not just education, it's not most of the standard measures of poverty and inequality, but it actually is much more to do with the quality of the early life and the quality of the parents supervising the child and the other institutions. What we've come to understand, and I can show you some evidence on, is that parental stimulation, engagement, and attachment are crucial. These parental resources promote resilience to adversity, and they promote investment in the child. So successful early childhood programs, and here I don't mean just government programs, I mean programs that really talk about developing the child from all sources of society, start early, they respect early family life, and they respect the sanctity of the family. And I think it's also important to understand what the recent literature does not say, and I think this has gotten lost in some of the popular discussions. Child poverty and social mobility are not solely or even mainly determined by the income available to families. And this is something that's getting lost and maybe getting even more lost in recent discussions. There's a danger and a rush to judgment in the current worry in the United States about the 99% versus the 1%. People are justly concerned about the rise in income inequality and justly concerned about the lack of social mobility in our society compared to many other societies. But what's happened recently is that many popular papers and polemical books focus on family income as the major determinant of government of child outcomes. And that's natural. In some sense, it's a natural outgrowth of the way we've traditionally thought about these issues. And so many people are even advocating bringing back programs from the 1960s that were evaluated and actually later found to be relatively unsuccessful in taking children out of poverty and giving them real life chances. So we know from a great deal of experience that an income transfer policy does not work to alleviate the problems of intergenerational income and status mobility. We know that just simply giving people more money or better housing or job training has not promoted intergenerational income mobility. These policies were tried, they were evaluated, and they actually failed. And for example, when President Clinton reformed welfare, reformed welfare in 1995, it was a judgment not made solely or even basically, mainly on political criteria, but on strong evidence. All the evidence, and this was the evidence also in the Clinton reform, but it's gotten stronger since the 1990s. All the evidence points to investment and not redistribution as the most effective anti-poverty policy that promotes long-run social mobility. And so here, I think when we talk about changing the lot of the poor and we think about helping people out in the larger world, we should think about pre-distribution, fixing early life initial conditions and not redistribution. And what we've come to learn is that if society helps early enough in the lives of children in a sustained way, it can improve cognitive and character skills and the health of disadvantaged children. So let me just talk briefly about some facts here. I'll use some script. I thought I had a little more room, so sorry for reading a bit here. But if we look at this figure, and this is a figure that was put out last year by the Congressional Budget Office, and it's really the source which is justified about how income at the top 1% of the old family income distribution has increased enormously since 1980. We see virtually a 300% increase. Whereas if you go at the bottom of the distribution, we haven't seen this happen. In fact, we've seen slow growth, and for some groups, even real wages declining. So we know that social and economic inequality is increasing. It's creating a divided society, a polarized society, and it's politically unstable. And this isn't just true in the United States. We also know that there's been stagnant growth in real wages for many people, except for the very highly skilled. So if you look at male high school dropouts, their real wages have declined substantially. That's the bottom line here with the blue dots. And if you look at the top, the people with graduate degrees have shown real improvement. And this is a source of a lot of discussion. So we know that the disadvantaged are under great stress, so is the middle class. We also know the problem with the housing crisis, that many people are underwater, 30 to 40% of mortgages are underwater. And there are persistent problems like crime, rising costs of health care, and the like. And so what we've seen in the last few years is that efforts to reduce inequality, increase productivity, and lower deficits have been mired in politics and polarization instead of practicality. So let me give you a few homilies, if you will, or truisms. The first is that the skills of the nation are a major source of its productivity. They're the major determinant of social and economic advantage. And if anything, in the last 3 decades, the importance of skills has become greater as trade has gotten more open, as technology has become more skill-based. So what we know is that at the same time, and this is an important finding for America, at the same time the demand for skilled workers has accelerated, America's overall rate of producing skilled workers has declined. Let me just show you some staggering statistics here, if you haven't seen these before. This is showing you something that's very puzzling to an economist. It's really showing the decline of the American blue-collar middle class. If you look at the base of this graph, what you see is workers, individuals now, born in 1900, and you see that there's been a fairly steady increase in the rate at which individuals have been going to college, although it decelerated starting around 1950, people born around 1950. But what you also see is the high school graduation rate reached a peak for people born around 1950, and if anything has increased in the last few years. And it's not due to immigration, it's not due simply to unskilled workers coming to the United States. So what we've seen is at a time when skills are going up, we've seen actually that the level of the workforce has not gone up commensurately. We've had more people going to college, but we now have more high school dropouts. And so what's happened is we've created a polarized society. Two Americas have emerged with increasing polarization. And for example, if we look now at the intergenerational persistence of income, I'm sure you've seen it, how much the father's income is correlated with the son's, what you'll see is that in the US that's estimated to be as high as 0.5 to 0.6. whereas in countries like Denmark it's 0.07, and in Canada about 0.17. So what you see is that there is really changing sense of what inequality is in America, and it's partly and largely driven by skills. So what I want you to think of in the rest of the talk is how can you address the skills problem effectively. And I want you to think about some approach that's not fragmented. The skills problem is at the core of many problems in American society, and I think it's important we understand that. Most of the discussions that are held have a very fragmented quality. They focus on one problem at a time. So if we're looking about crime, you have more police. To promote skills, you say build more schools, have better test scores. For health, have more doctors. For teenage pregnancy, have teenage pregnancy programs and so forth. So what we have is basically a fragmented approach, and I want to present what I think is an effective integrated approach. So the argument is fairly direct. Modern society is based on skills. These low levels of skills cause a variety of problems. Dropping out of school, I already mentioned, crime, teenage pregnancy, obesity, and poor health. Multiple skills, and that's another important lesson, that cognitive skills are not the whole story. Personality skills, soft skills, physical and mental health, perseverance, attention, motivation, and self-confidence are important and are often neglected. Now, gaps in all these skills open up very early between the haves and the have-nots. They open up before schooling begins. And so the lives of young children, the family lives, are the major producers of these skills. But family influence is more than some transmission of genes. Cognitive and social skills are not fixed at birth. They are not solely genetically determined, and they can be enhanced. And so here we see the powerful role of the family that I don't think is fully appreciated. Many people don't want to address the very hard aspects that family life is really in crisis, not only in the US, but around the world. And if we supplement family life, we can imagine programs that will produce more effective children. If society intervenes early enough and social institutions intervene early enough in a consistent fashion, it will promote these abilities and help eliminate these gaps. So let me just give you some idea about this and give you some pieces of evidence. I don't know how evidence-based your discussions have been, but I'm an economist and so forth. But I would simply say family is important, more important than schools, and that the early years are more important than public policy currently acknowledges. So what do we know about the importance of cognitive and character skills? Well, we recently have a lot of hard evidence on soft skills, what are called soft skills. Most public policy evaluation is thinking about cognitive skills, looking at test scores. So the Europeans will know the PISA scores receive complete attention in Germany and also all over Europe, and they do in Chile and they do in many countries around the world. But the PISA scores capture only a small slice of the character traits that matter. And so what I want to show you is that these traits matter. So for example, here's some study that we've done here in the United States with Jora Stieksrud and Sergio Arzua. And if you ask the question, if you go from the bottom of the distribution for both cognitive and non-cognitive skills to the top of the distribution, you'll see that those people who are low in both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, personality skills, are much more likely to have been in jail. Those high end are much less likely to go to jail. If you ask about teenage pregnancy, young teenage girls being single with children, again, these skills make a big difference. So if we ask who graduates college, if you go from the bottom to the top, the probability rises dramatically. So these skills are major predictors of lifetime success. And I'll give you one other example which I think shows the folly of looking only at test scores. In the United States we have a program called the GED program. It's a program given to high school dropouts. They can take a test and that certifies that they're just as good as ordinary high school graduates, okay? About 12% of all credentials in the United States are issued through the GED. And if you look at the test score, the PISA type score, and you ask how do the GEDs compare to ordinary high school graduates, they're about the same. The graph, I don't know if you can see it, there's an arrow pointing to the GEDs here, and the high school graduates, their abilities are roughly the same. The exam works in certifying. On the other hand, if you ask what do the GEDs do? Well, the GEDs, even though many of them start college, they start almost everything. They start in the military, they start various kinds of activities, they start marriage. These people drop out of everything they do, including college. So close to 30% of all the high school graduates are graduating college with a BA. Tiny fraction, less than a tenth, is doing this from the GED. And so you ask, what's the difference? Well, the GEDs are individuals who are very high in cognitive skills and very low in these personality and social skills. They matter, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that they matter. So that's exhibit that I think is very important. So if we look at this question of intergenerational transfers and how can we do this, we should understand that skill gaps, not income gaps, explain the major gap between ability groups and between different ethnic and social groups. So many people are justly concerned about the gap between whites and blacks, for example. In completing high school, the white-Latino gap is even greater. But once you adjust for those abilities, those cognitive and social and emotional abilities, that gap, which favors whites, actually favors minority groups. And the reason is affirmative action and other policies that are in place in the United States. The same is true if you ask who goes to college. Gaps that actually are working against minorities are actually rectified once you control for the individual ability. Now you say, okay, that's interesting, but what can we do about ability? And here I want to just suggest to you, first of all, that ability gaps are opening up very early. This is, for example, a study that I've done with some child development experts. And if you look, for example, at this, you'll see these are test scores. The topmost graph would be the test scores of children whose mothers are college graduates. The bottommost graph is the graph of test scores for individuals who are mothers or high school dropouts. So you see a huge gap at age 18. And it's that ability that explains the gap in who goes to college. So these are very important criteria. But you'll also notice another thing. The gap that's there at age 18 is already there by age 5. It's there at age 3. And so you ask yourself, well, that's interesting. Here, somebody who believes purely in genetics could argue, okay, what you've seen is a manifestation of genes. And I want to argue that genes play a role. 50% of these traits are inherited, but still, there's a huge role. And here we come to the role of the family. So if you look at what American family life is like in the last 30 or 40 years, you'll see some staggering trends. And unfortunately, these trends are true around the world. It's not just in the United States. I could give you similar trends in Chile, in Mexico, many countries in Europe as well. So what you see starting in 1975, you can see that the proportion of children under 18 living in a single-parent family has grown enormously. And the single greatest growth factor is children growing up in homes where there's never been a second parent. These are children growing up with a single parent, and typically a mother, and typically a distressed mother, and a mother without money resources. So that's a huge issue. So here, for example, is a recent figure about the percentage of all births to unmarried women in the United States. It's approaching 40%. In Mexico, it's even higher. So why am I saying what's important? Why is family life so important? Well, I think you will all know intuitively it's important, but this has been studied in a way that actually connects directly to the other topics I'm talking about. If you ask, for example, what are the vocabularies of children who grow up in different environments? So you get mothers. So if you go to mothers who are highly educated, you'll see that within 26 months of birth, these kids have vocabulary sizes around 800 words. If you ask, well, what about a sort of a middle class, lower middle class environment, you'll see medium level of speech. Well, the vocabulary is considerably diminished. Remember, these kids are just barely more than 2 years of age at the end of this graph. And then kids from the most severely disadvantaged environment will have about 1/4 of the vocabulary. If you actually ask, what are these environments giving these children, you see the emergence of the problem. So if you look at children from welfare, disadvantaged kids, you can ask in a typical hour, how many words does a kid hear? 616 words, 5 affirmatives, and 11 negative statements. If you look at working class kids, about double that amount. More affirmatives than prohibitions. And if you ask professional families, the highly educated mothers, the intact families, you get something like 2,000 words. That's in an hour. And if you look at the accumulation of this, by the time the children are age 4, you can see gaps that are in the ratio of 3 to 4 to 1. That is part of the reason why you see those gaps in ability when poor children even enter school. And so the cumulative vocabulary deficits are real. So let me suggest, I don't know how much time I have left, a few minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, oh, that's good, okay, that's fine. So let me try to suggest something, because I think this is this notion that somehow skills are captured by test scores, that somehow IQ is all that matters, that these things are inherited, that there's not much we can do with children, that's a fairly pervasive belief. And let me show you a very dramatic program that I've studied, I'm working with. A group of children who are all inner city disadvantaged children, all of them selected for reasons, for various reasons, to be subnormal IQ, were actually all given intervention, or some of them were given interventions, randomly assigned to interventions, and others were given, put in a control group. These children were followed, they're now age 50. This intervention took place in the 1960s in a town outside of Detroit, Ypsilanti, Michigan, that's got severe poverty problems. And so this program was followed, and what did the program do? The program actually was teaching kids verbal skills, it was teaching things, it was teaching what you might expect schools to teach, but the central task was that kids came in each day, they were told to plan a task, to do a task, and to review the task. They did this 5 days a week, a few hours a day. The program also visited with the children, with the families, the children with the family. And so it also gave advice to the mother, it gave advice on child rearing, it encouraged parent-child interactions. Now when this program was first evaluated, it was viewed to be a failure. So initially a great success, like Head Start. You saw a surge in IQ. So by age 4, these kids had an IQ boost from 80 to 95. But then it went down to 85, which was the average for that population. If you looked at the control group, they seemed to be lagging considerably, but by age 10, they had more or less the same ability. So many people looked at that and said this program failed. And that's exactly what the IQ test-based evaluation of social policy would tell us. But what I would say is the following. When we look at these children and we look at what their ratings by teachers and their peers on their personal behaviors, how well they could stay on task, how well they could actually manage their anger. And when we follow these children out in their lifetimes, we see tremendous increases in terms of their behavior. It turns out even though their achievement, their IQ test scores are no higher, the kids in this group actually do better on achievement tests. And the reason is they're more motivated. So they're not only smarter, but they're more motivated. They stay in school, they're heavily influenced by what's going on in school. And so what you can see in a number of dimensions of social traits is that there's a huge boost in these non-cognitive traits, and that they matter and that they persist over the lifetime. So a neglected dimension of this program came out in the terms of soft skills. And you ask, well, why am I going on about this program? Well, it's been evaluated not just in terms of the benefits, lower crime, higher employment, higher education, that last over 50-year lifetimes, improved health, reduced smoking, a number of dimensions showing improvement. But it also in terms of the economic rate of return, what each dollar invested pays off. The estimates range between 6 to 10% per year, certainly much higher than the U.S. interest rate now and most interest rates. But even if you look at the stock market in the U.S. between the end of the Second World War and 2008, or 2007, the meltdown, that's a higher rate of return than you got by investing just in the equity. So there's a tremendous lesson, I think, that should be learned from here. And I could give you many other lessons. Maybe it'll come out in the course of our discussion. But it shows not only that these non-cognitive skills matter, but that they affect behavior and that they can be influenced. There are a number of programs in place, not just early childhood programs, but the early childhood programs have been the most effective. You get a child when the child's young, you work with the child, you encourage the child, you create a skill base that's lasting and that actually will build success throughout the rest of life. So the key idea is to understand the dynamics of skill formation, that skills beget skills, and so here's just a schematic about what an econometric model would look like. So personality and social skills have a direct payoff for cognitive skills, and those skills feed into the stock of cognitive skills. Why? Because even though the kids, we just saw the Perry kids, they're no smarter, they actually work harder at school, they stay on task, they're much more open to experience, they're much more engaged in learning. We also see that health, although I haven't emphasized it, asthma, various assaults to health can have serious issues in terms of promoting just days lost in school, ability to concentrate. And of course, cognitive skills produce better health practices and the like. So what we've come to understand is that this process is synergistic and that academic success promotes greater self-confidence. We've also learned, and this is an unpleasant story, but it is still a story, that when we look at intervention programs that start in the adolescent years, for kids who haven't had good home environments, who simply haven't had the kind of encouragement and nurturance that young children in more advantaged environments have, we see that those kids with current programs have typically not gotten the same success. And it's much harder. Skills harden. People become less malleable. And we know for sure that by age 10 or 11, the rank of cognitive skills, the rank stability of cognitive skills, very high. Certainly IQ rank is very high. If you're high in the distribution 11, unless you go to prison or have some great shock to your life story, that you're going to find yourself still relatively smart in the distribution. Non-cognitive skills are a little more malleable, and that's associated with work in neuroscience, suggesting that the prefrontal cortex is developing more slowly. But still, what we've learned is that if we are going to remediate for disadvantaged adolescents, we should probably do it more in the form of work-based education that actually creates assimilation of individuals into the workplace and teaches them social skills. Let me just make one fact, because education is so heavily emphasized. If you look at what the return is to education, it's important. Here is a graph that is very common. This is from British data, but we could do the same. We've done the same in the US. So if you look at the height of the bar, you see somebody who just goes beyond the compulsory level of schooling compared to somebody who drops out just at the minimum age. You can see that there are substantial increases of education. Just add the two bars together. High rate of return for wages, high increase in employment, increase in exercise, healthy behaviors, less depression, less smoking. But if you decompose this, as a lot of recent work is done, one finds that, yeah, education itself has a role, but the early life factors that promote education, that are present even before people enter school, are the major component of what we see embodied in education. So let me just conclude with a graph, which is a schematic of a very large literature. This literature essentially is looking at the returns to a unit dollar invested. And what it's showing is that if we imagine taking a young child, just a young child, a very, very young child, we don't worry. The parents will go along with anything we say, so we don't worry about the parents may undo. That's a huge problem, and I'm just minimizing that in this diagram. So I'm saying we take this, we basically say, if we were to invest $1, and just the first dollar, where in the life cycle would it have the highest rate of return? Where would you get the biggest benefit? And it's in the early years, and for a very common sense, obvious reason. You're building the skill base that makes it easier to go to school, to achieve a number of things in life. And so what you find is the rate of return is diminishing. It's not to say that it's low for job training. In fact, for schooling, very able, highly motivated children, the rates of return have been estimated to be as high as 20%. So you get a very able, so it's not saying that that return is low. We're saying, where's the first dollar spent? Most advantaged. Now, that's where the problem of income and social inequality has a huge consequence. The advantaged children are getting those early investments. They're getting them, and if anything, the time budget studies have shown there's a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. That some work by Sarah McClanahan and Susan Bianchi have actually shown that more educated mothers, even though they're working more, are spending more time in child development with their children because they know the value of it. Less educated women are not doing so, so the gap is emerging. So for less advantaged mothers, for less advantaged children, the wisdom of this diagram is not respected. And a lot of social policy typically is directing much more resource towards criminal rehabilitation, job training, rather than the early years towards schooling. So let me just summarize very briefly what I've said, unless I am over my limit. So just summarize. So I'm really going to reiterate the points. I think I can make it very simply. The problem of rising inequality and the lack of social mobility in the family is a skills problem. We have a skills problem. we have to think more broadly what skills are. It's not just schooling. It's not just a PISA score. It's not just a test. Skills consist of an ability to deal with social reality, to deal with your peers, to manage your own anger, to show some humility, to show some ability to work with others. These things are typically viewed as not being scientifically rigorous, although I will point out that the OECD is now commissioning a study, and if any of you will be in Paris in about a year, I'm going to talk about that study. So the OECD is actually commissioning a study which will be attended, I think, by ministers of many countries around the world, precisely to put back these personality and so-called soft skills onto the table. We know that moral education, that education of what's called character education sometime, was at one point the backbone of the common school in America. And it gradually got phased out for a variety of reasons. Cognitive psychology came along and said cognition was mostly what mattered. The separation of church and state made it awkward for people to talk about putting in moral and character education, at least in the public schools. And for a number of reasons, for questions of pluralism, just exactly what character was all about, it became very much less fashionable in the recent last 50 or 60 years to educate. But we know that when you think about the decline of this type of education in schools, coupled with the problems in the American family, where children are simply not getting the resources, that our production of these character skills has substantially diminished. So these skills and skill deficits are major contributors to these problems. And I think I don't have to repeat everything I said before, although I could. I would just simply say we have to think more broadly. I think we should really think more broadly about what skills are, what skills matter, when they're formed, and the important role of social policy in supporting the family. Now, I know that in some quarters there's a view of shotgun weddings. The idea is just having people married to be married is a good thing. And that's not completely clear from the studies that I've seen in psychology. Putting together two warring adults may not exactly foster the most productive children. But the family is challenged, and social policy has to recognize it. And most American political discussions simply don't want to admit it. The family is viewed. I was recently at a seminar at Boston University Law School, and we were talking about the legacy of Thurgood Marshall, the famous litigator and later Supreme Court Justice. And I couldn't help but raise the issue of the 50-year-old now, but still, I think, highly irrelevant Moynihan report. For those of you who remember the Moynihan report, Moynihan was talking about the fact that the African-American family was in crisis. 28% of all the kids. Now, if you ask in the African-American family in particular, it's more like 80% of children born out of wedlock. But the figures that Moynihan was citing for the African-American family are now true for the society at large. And what we've understood in the last 50 years, more than intuition, more than teaching over many, many millennia have actually shown, is that these family factors matter. And so social policy really has to integrate the family and the things that families produce. So thank you very much for your attention.